Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shikhar Sharma, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies. It brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome to each one of you for another enriching book discussion by the Institute of Chinese Studies. The title of the book for today's book discussion is Beyond Binaries, The World of India and China. Beyond Binaries, The World of India and China explores the complexities of the relationship between India and China. The book takes a nuanced approach, moving beyond simplistic categorizations of good or bad to analyze the strategic calculations that drive these Asian giants' interactions. It examines the period from 2008 to 2022, exploring instances of cooperation in international forums alongside persistent challenges like border disputes. Beyond binaries, the world of India and China goes further, exploring the roles of other stakeholders in the region, including South Asian nations and global powers like the United States. Today's discussion aims to explore the motivation behind the book, discuss its key arguments, and shed light on how it challenges us to move beyond binary thinking when considering India and China's relationship. The speaker for today's discussion is Mr. Shastri Ramachandran, a journalist, editor, and columnist with a special focus on national and global affairs, particularly regarding Nepal, Sri Lanka, and China. Currently, he contributes to Beyond TV and BeyondNews.com. Mr. Ramachandran possesses a rich journalistic background, having worked with several newspapers like the Times of India, the Tribune, and China Daily. He is the co-editor of the book State of Nepal and co-author of Media, Conflict, and Peace. We are also honored to have Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari as the discussant for this discussion. Dr. Tiwari is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Shahid Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi. She is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Her areas of specialization include East Asian regionalism, China's political economy, and the foreign policies of China and India. She was the recipient of several fellowships, including the visiting program for young sinologists in 2017, awarded by the Ministry of Culture, People's Republic of China, among others. Chairing today's discussion is Professor Srimati Chakrabarti, Chairperson and Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. She is a former professor of Chinese Studies at the University of Delhi and has held distinguished positions such as the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies. Her publications include China and the Naxalites, Mao, China's Intellectual and the Cultural Revolution, and China. We are fortunate to have her expertise guide this insightful conversation. Now, before I hand over to the chair, I would request all participants to adhere to some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. You may post your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you'll be called upon to unmute yourself and then ask questions. Please remember to mention your name and affiliation while posting your questions. Now, I hand over the floor to the chair. Over to you, Professor Chakrabarti.
Yeah. Thank you, Shikhar. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's book discussion. Uh, Shikhar has said a few introductory things, so I will not repeat them. But let me specially welcome Mr. Shastri Ramachandran, and who will be talking about the book, and also Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari, who is the discussant. Okay, now I got a chance to read the book and I found it extremely enjoyable. And it is definitely a good read. And I learned a few things from the book. One of them being that India and China were competing with each other to show, Buddhism belongs to whom, and especially in the context of Southeast Asia. That was something I really did not know, in spite of being in China studies for so many years. The initial part of the book is about Mr. Shastri Ramachandran's foray as a journalist in China, his experience with the Chinese media, and he draws a very interesting picture of what the ecosystem of the Chinese media is. That is something which is very enlightening, and I'm sure those who read it will now have a better idea of that. And the second part of the book is, I mean, the most of the book is devoted to India China relations, their interactions and the ups and downs of the last few years, last in fact 14 years. He was in China for 14 years, which I don't think any other journalist has experienced that many years in China. And the best chapter for me in the book was the one on the media in India and China, and what kind of uh, views they project, what kind of ideas they talk about, and that projects it makes the other country very negative in the eyes of the people. For instance, in the mainstream Indian media, not especially the electronic media, uh, does not really project the reality. And in India, especially in the northern part, people watch Aaj Tak and only Aaj Tak. So, their perception of China, therefore, can never be balanced. So, that part of the book is very interesting. And well, I don't think I want to say much, talk much, because I'm sure everybody's waiting to hear Mr. Shastri Ramachandran. And well, the format of the discussion will be the same as usual. First, Mr. Ramachandran talks about the book. He speaks for about 25 minutes. Then Ritusha takes over. She will speak for roughly 15 minutes. And if she raises any questions or has any queries, Mr. Ramachandran will respond to those. And after that, the floor will be open to, for Q&A. So thank you all once again for joining us, for this discussion, book discussion. And over to you, Mr. Ramachandran. Please.
Thank you, Professor Srimati Chakravarti, for the words of welcome. I wish to thank the Institute of Chinese Studies for inviting me here. And I want to thank Shikhar Sharma for his opening remarks. And, it's a very big thing. We invited to the Institute of Chinese Studies and for its Wednesday seminar, so fabled. 1969, if I'm not mistaken, it's there. And I'm really honored and a bit overwhelmed to take this place here and speak to you. I have had a few events and I don't want to repeat myself because I think what I say here should be distinctive and for this place here. And it should be entirely different from what I've said before. And I have prepared a note from which I shall read out about the book and what it says. First and foremost, once again, formally, I'm thankful to the Institute of Chinese Studies for inviting me to its Wednesday seminar to talk about my book, Beyond Binaries, The World of India and China, within such a short time after it was released. It was released on January 27th at the India International Center by the former Chief of Army Staff, General M.M. Naravan. The invitation is indeed an honor, and I am honored and overwhelmed by those who have joined this meeting. And I can see these big names here. I don't want to repeat all of them, but I see my friend Ravi Bhutalingam and a very promising young but no less intimidating scholar, Ritusha Tiwari, and so many other names that are there, and my colleagues too, like Vijay Nayak, and so on. So I'm acquainted with the credentials and the individuals, who work in the Institute of Chinese Studies. And I've all along had admirable dedication for their work in the area of Chinese studies, all of which I have benefited from directly and indirectly over the years. I could not have completed this book without the support of the Institute of Objective Studies, which arranged for it to be published by Genuine Publications and Media. This book is based on my writings on India, China, and their often tumultuous relationship. It seeks to explain in some detail why New Delhi and Beijing do what they do. The book takes a close look at their respective positions, conversations, and confrontations, and the underlying factors. It shows why, at times, they are pulled in different directions and why differences are emphasized and turn into disputes, although the avowed intention all along was to not allow differences to become disputes. The book is a succinct history of how relations between the two Asian neighbors have evolved over the 15 years from 2008 to 2022, and the internal and bilateral compulsions that have shaped them. The book strives to make the reader aware about the strategic thinking that went into each move and counter move by the two nations that are often at odds with each other as they are at present. Beyond Binaries, the world of India and China is an attempt to deepen understanding of the recent history of Sino-Indian relations. And as the title suggests, look at China-India relations without putting it in the category of good or bad, friend or enemy, partner or rival, competitor or collaborator. Through its different chapters, the book showcases Chinese society and its politics, India-China relations, the good, the bad, and all that there is to China and the bilateral relations. The book looks at the areas where relations between India and China have become worse, such as the boundary issue, for instance, and areas where the two countries have cooperated to maximize gains, the economic front, and in international organizations. For me, it is a different telling of the story of India and China and what constitutes their world. In redefining how stories from and about China and India China are told, I have tried to avoid the familiar tropes and, above all, even at the risk of inviting criticism, tried to be objective insofar as it is possible for an Indian observer and narrator to be when it comes to China and all things Chinese. The narrative is meant to take the reader beyond the binaries in which perceptions of India and China, their relationship, and their role on the world stage is trapped. There are chapters on other players, big and small, that are involved in and impacted by the relations, such as the South Asian countries, Africa, and the US, and on forums such as BRICS, SCO, and SARC, where India and China at times cooperate and at other times take pot shots at each other. I've also dealt with India's bid to gain membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group and how New Delhi went about it, where it tripped, its words and deeds, and why, in my considered view, the effort was foredoomed. The book's format is a departure from convention in the way India-China relationship is presented. The book is both for interested students and readers, as well as scholars and those acquainted with the subject. It is based on a large body of my writings over a period of 15 years from both inside and outside of it, and published in Indian, Chinese, and international media. The book is not hyper-nationalistic in its tone, and as I said earlier, I have done my best to look at the relationship with a high level of objectivity, which of course may be faulted. For all my striving for objectivity, one criticism I have heard from more than one informed reader is that I have not been able to conceal my being an admirer of India's Ministry of External Affairs. It is undeniable that in large measure I have benefited immensely in my understanding as a journalist, in my understanding of international relations and bilateral relations from many of India's fine diplomats I have interacted with over the last 25, 30 years. However, they are not the only ones who may have influenced. I have also learned from experts and scholars on the subject. Besides my travels and exposure to individuals and institutions in the countries I wrote about. In the case of China and India-China relations, I have had the benefit of interactions with Chinese experts, scholars, diplomats, and think tanks, besides the many Westerners with an interest in this area that I have heard and read in India and in China. Yet, many of those who have been critical in the best sense of the term of my book, are those serving or retired officials from India's Ministry of External Affairs. I take that as a compliment, especially with reference to my objectivity in the matter of this book, which has drawn what I consider good but critical responses from serving and retired MEA officials. And doubtless, in the many years I was covering the MEA and traveling and writing on international relations and diplomacy, there was much to admire the men and women I came to know who negotiated India's way in a fraught world, especially the neighborhood. Before I set out briefly the sections of the book, a few clarifications would be in order. First and foremost, I did not live continuously in China for a period of 15 years. I worked there off and on. I had short spells and long stays. And almost every year, I traveled a couple of times. And even while in India, I maintained my interest and remained engaged with China, along with the neighborhood, almost to the exclusion of all other countries which I used to cover before, and national politics and policies. The second thing is that this book is based on my writings and the material I gathered from 2008 to 22, maybe from a little before and a little after too. It was written keeping in mind different groups of readers, from diplomats and experts to journalists, researchers, students, and those who read about China without being any of these. I was persuaded to work on it by some China scholars, journalists, diplomats, retired MEA officials, and friends who have been reading my writings from and on China since 2008. I am also very grateful to them for having prevailed upon me to undertake this and help me complete the book. I want to clarify that this book is not a mere compilation or collection of articles and reports that I had written during those years. If it has been taken to be such, it is because in the author's note, I have described it erroneously as a compilation. Those who have read the book know this only too well. This clarification is for those who have not. I shall correct these terminological errors which I overlooked in the next print run. I hope so. My first glimpse of China was in 2008, January, when I traveled with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh for his economic summit, the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, which set the tone and triggered wide-ranging and intensive engagements between the world's two most populous countries. When I landed in China, I almost forgot everything that I had been reading. From my teens on China, from the years when we had people shouting on India's streets, especially in Calcutta, that China's chairman is our chairman. And there used to be a whole lot of reports. And the more sober reports that we read or work of scholarship that time, perhaps the only person I can recall now, apart from Harvey Stockwin in Hong Kong and B.K. Tiwari of the Indian Express and G.K. Reddy and so on, is Mr. G.P. Deshpande. In fact, we consider it a great honor to be able to get our hands on a copy of Economic and Political Weekly to read G.P. Deshpande. So somehow when you land in China, and so much was happening when I landed, that everything that I had read about had receded from my mind. And thankfully, I had carried some of those books with me, especially Max Weber's book on Religions of China. Since then, until 2016, as I said, off and on, I have worked in Beijing. First as senior editor and writer, Comment and Opinion with China Daily, and then with Global Times. And after a gap of some years, I went back again to work as senior consultant and editor of the bilateral magazine, China-India Dialogue. That was from 2015 when it was launched. I was the editor when it was launched by the China International Publishing Group to 2016. Besides, I have traveled to China several times, including to the Xinjiang and Tibet autonomous regions, quite a few times from 2013 to 2009. And one of these was before Narendra Modi's first visit to China as Prime Minister. I was among the few who was invited to do a series of curtain raisers on his visit and the prospects it held of Sino-Indian rapprochement. The stints in Beijing were a splendid opportunity for me to write on mainstream issues of interest in both India and China. I continued writing for the Global Times even after leaving the editorial stable and was a columnist for China.org and CGTN, previously known as cctvnews.com. Working at a senior level in Chinese and Indian newspaper organizations allowed me access to the foreign ministry's briefings in both countries and to informed sources, besides scholars and serving retired diplomats. Together, these offered me a unique opportunity to develop and put forward a distinctive viewpoint and perspective on issues. I could look at China, as I said earlier, from inside and the outside, which helped me gain an understanding of the country and its people and what's going on there at various levels. The writings from which this book has been composed include articles, some papers presented at seminars and conferences, and book chapters written for various Indian, Chinese, and international media and institutions in different capacities. The Indian media, where the articles were published, includes DNA, Daily News and Analysis, Beyond Newscom, The Citizen, The Tribune, The Times of India, and Sakal Marathi. Among the international media that published and circulated my writings in a number of languages across continents are IPS, the Berlin-based International Press Syndicate, and IDN In-Depth. The articles and papers have often been topical dispatches with context and analysis from which I have drawn for this book. The idea behind the style of the book, short pieces on a variety of topics related to China, Sino-Indian relations, and what makes up their world, is to provide an easy read to both the subject experts, journalists, academics, officials, students, as well as those who are just starting off and want to cultivate an interest in the region. For its structure and style, it may be called a new age book, where readers have the possibility of treating each topic as a standalone portion, part of a whole, or a composite whole bound together by common thread, somewhat like a music album, where you may choose to listen to all, a few, or any one of the songs. The topics range from my travels in China and those first glimpses of the country to the boundary issue and differences, disputes, and irritants that mark India-China ties, along with a wealth of information, background, analysis, and insights gathered over time from a wide range of sources in India, China, and other countries. At the same time, there is attention to and emphasis, perhaps more than in most such efforts, on the common interests of India and China. In fact, one of the premises for the China-India dialogue magazine was that India and China have more common interests than bilateral differences. The common interest can take precedence over bilateral differences. The compilation is not linear or chronological. Events and developments related to each topic are compiled in a sequential order so as to provide easy and comprehensive understanding of the issues involved. Coming to the text, the introduction is what my introduction was to China in 2008. The astonishing scale and pace of infrastructural development, the globalization that was unmissable in the marketplace, the profusion of brands, and the pulsating aspirational Beijing, and discovering that Chinese media is not a monolith and offers opportunity to expatriates from all over the world to find their place in it, grasp its niches and nuances, and come to terms with it. Second part of the introduction, Beyond the Great Wall, has 4 subsections: society, politics, economy, media, and cybersecurity, on facets of China's development from the time of the bicycle to automobilization, and the traditional to the modern scientific. The evolution of the population policy, especially the relaxation of the one-child policy, China's phenomenal economic growth, its rise to globalism through pursuit of a number of policies, including the One Belt, One Road project, China's manifest financial clout, borne out by its inclusion of the RMB, the SDR basket of currencies, the reaffirmation of the primacy of the Communist Party, and its celebration of 90 years, followed by the rise of a political cult rooted in a crusade against corruption that crushed political opponents such as Bo Xilai, and the rise of Xi Jinping as a core leader with an unprecedented cult status, amplified by the Hydra-headed media in a way that would have been unimaginable in the time of Mao Zedong. Although the book is not about bilateral relations is a very important part of the book. It looks at the way the two countries were from 62, the build-up to, and the phase of cooperation, including during the global financial downturn of 2008, to the re-emergence of conflict and distrust in the India-China relationship. The next section on the world of India and China dwells on the Asian giants at play in the world in the multilateral forums, at times together and at other times against each other. This section takes in BRICS, SCO, SAARC, and the nuclear suppliers group, among other third spaces where the two countries contest. There is also particular focus on China as a world power and its performance on the global stage. Then comes what I found to be the most fascinating part for me, looking at media, as much in India as in China, is about Indian media's treatment of China, which shows India in extremely poor light, or rather those who are writing in the Indian media on China, for the way China is reported and portrayed in this country, with the Indian media being more hostile and prejudiced than even the state and government, that is the Indian state and government, would want it to be. In fact, Indian media is more of a wolf warrior than even the Chinese diplomats were painted to be for a brief period in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. Indian media's illiberal tendencies and prejudices are at its best, or should I say worst, when it comes to its neighbors, particularly China, the biggest and the most powerful, and Nepal, the poorest. In fact, even the government does not expect the media to stoop to this level to further its own objectives for purported reasons of state. Of course, there are a few honorable exceptions in the media and in India. And when it comes to China, among the honorable exceptions, I must mention are the China correspondents of Indian newspapers who were and are, even when out of China, doing a brave job. They stand out for their integrity, credibility, and insights while working in a situation where the odds are heavy and in conditions akin to being between a rock and a hard place, literally. The other side of this is the role of Chinese media, the state, its agencies, and the think tanks. How they go about setting the agenda, media management, dictating Chinese viewpoints of India and the world, influencing Indian perceptions, and scripting media interventions at home and in pursuit of China's objectives. What might be disappointing and unflattering to India and Indian media is that India does not loom large there. The Chinese media is not preoccupied with India, whereas Indian media is obsessed with China and in a very unhealthy. In the concluding chapter, I've taken to reading the tea leaves and seeing what could be the way forward for the two countries to actualize the Asian century where the two tigers could cohabit on one mountain. Many people might feel it's been very presumptuous on my part to read the tea leaves and set out what I think, because I'm not in a position to implement or push for any of these. But then such writing is a reflex born of half a lifetime of editorial writing for newspapers, mainly in India, but also in China, where in writing this, I have violated the cardinal rule of media holding forth with the predictable on the one hand, on the other hand approach. And I've actually chosen to speak my mind, knowing full well that it would be laughed off by the community of strategic experts, seasoned diplomats, China studies scholars, military advisors, and others who are in the very difficult business of negotiating or aiding and assisting the improvement of India-China relations. The point of such a conclusion, as I have written, is not to prescribe, but to set out my thoughts in a palatable and provocative manner that may cause the listeners and readers to reflect and react to what I assume makes, at the least, for a good reading. My heartfelt thanks to everyone who has gathered here, the distinguished learned and erudite minds who have made the time to join the seminar. To me, your present and valued participation in this is a very thrilling experience. I feel that the long time and effort in writing this book has been well and truly rewarded by this Wed This Day seminar, which I shall cherish as a landmark achievement of the book. And for making that happen, I remain grateful to the ICS chairperson, Srimati Chakravarti, Director Alka Acharya, and Dr. Ritu Tiwari, who is here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramachandran. I think that was a very compact and competent summary of the book, and it, of course, you know, explains many of the things that probably we normally don't understand, especially the section on the media, as I said earlier. Now, let me turn to Dr. Ritushamani Tiwari for to do her job as the discussant. Ritusha?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, the Institute of Chinese Studies, for inviting me to be the discussant for a very, very important book, Beyond Binaries, The World of India and China. The book is a timely intervention about India-China comparisons as it contextualizes various developments unfolding in China in the last 1.5 decades. The book foregrounds these developments with an Indian view. And the most important aspect of this book is that it comes with an antithesis uh, against what is indeed the fashionable way of emphasizing about India-China relations in terms of binaries, which are rooted in competition and conflict. So the book presents an antithesis to those binaries by convincing the reader about the importance of various aspects of, China itself, India-China relations, their worldviews, and in a very lucid and appealing manner, which keeps the reader very interested. The extensive experience of the author as a journalist working across media organizations, as he very well rightly pointed out, in China between 2008 and 2020, provides him with a very incisive eye to China, and he uses this phrase in his book. He analyzes China's development and changes in terms of various dimensions, simultaneously drawing parallels in the remarkable transformations in India that happened during that time, while highlighting the exceptional shift within the Chinese society, politics, economy, foreign policy, and various other domains. Shastri notes the contentious one-child policy in China, the political power struggle in China, anti-corruption, drives, and de-acceleration in the economy as some of the major watershed events of China's transformation. Uh, the author has captured both the external and internal perspectives and interplay of factors around these events between the set time period of 2008 to 2022. Notwithstanding the present rift in India-China relationship, the author has also been able to maintain the emphasis on many potential avenues which could serve as sites of fruitful cooperation between the two countries. A case in this particular regard is his insight into the mutual benefits between China's investment capacity and the experience of manufactured infrastructure building, on the other hand, of China, vis-a-vis India's massive infrastructural needs and growing markets, on the other hand. And in the context of tracing India-China relations, Shastri begins that by looking at the historic visit of Rajiv Gandhi in 1988, which basically paves the ground for Manmohan Singh's economic summit with Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao in 2008. So that entire trajectory is traced very well, and the book sheds light on the thawing of Sino-Indian ties in the years following the 1962 Chinese invasion. The book then discusses the flourishing new phase between the two countries and identifies the differences and difficulties that cause tensions and disputes in the current Narendra Modi Xi Jinping engagements. And I think in terms of identifying these differences, difficulties, it is very interesting that the author has given a very, very accurate picture. And I would like to quote him. with regards to that, in terms of how the diplomatic ineptitude of India is one of the difficulties that India-China relations basically have been experiencing. The ineptitude, if that is something that can be that particular problem can be solved from India's side, it would be much better. It would be much better for India's China policy. Uh, and he's quoting this particular incident where Modi discovered to his dismay that personal chemistry rarely plays a role in China's international relations. uh, Ramachandran acknowledges that following the Galwan clashes, developments in recent years, especially since 2020, have demolished much of Sino-Indian achievements which were achieved in the last 40-45 years, uh, which is basically leading everyone to question whether China-India relationship. And it is clear that Modi intended to move the relationship in a positive direction, um, and this could be because India is looking at multi-alignment. It is looking at multiple poles of solidarity, multiple engagements, and multi-layered diplomacy. And the author has been speculating that why Galwan occurred. Perhaps China's provocative military attack, in his words, could very well have been to establish deterrence against India more than any or all of these, aspects of China's, ambitions for supremacy in Asia, or India's alliance with US and Quad, and its opposition to Belt and Road Initiative, so on and so forth. And I think this makes for a very, very plausible explanation. Uh, has India truly been under any kind of impression that uh, that uh, that India can circumvent China's supremacy in the region? If that is the kind of impression that any quarters in India have, I think what Shastri is trying to say here is that China is using its advantage to basically allay that kind of impression, and perhaps nip it in the bud, as it were. And it is an interesting proposition to basically consider, uh, but I think there's more data required to support as to what are exactly the reasons behind uh, you know uh, incursions in Galwan from the side of China. This is an interesting conjecture, but it would need a lot of data as to whether this conjecture is actually correct or not. Uh, and then another very captivating portion of the book is Shastri's insight into Chinese media organizations, where he is looking at manufacturing mindsets. Here, he demolishes the myth of China as a monolith and brings out the diversity and order defying tendencies amongst the Chinese people. At the same time, this chapter also leaves the reader wanting for more about the role of media in China as an active site of shifting political narratives, cultures, and debates. And I think that is something that also provides fodder for the subsequent next writing that the author may have in mind. Shastri refers to power struggle between the party, the government, and the military in China, and it would have benefited the reader immensely if a more deeper nuance of these struggles and contradictions were basically brought out unraveled. The media organ of the party remains a very live site of these power struggles, and explicating their intricacies remains a challenge for any author on this subject. Despite differences between the different party and state organs, Shastri concludes that the Chinese media manages perceptions of India and cites five concrete examples of tight management in this regard. The impact and interplay of various layers of party pantheons, including elites, institutions, bureaucracy, media, management, all of these is a very, very interesting picture that Shastri puts together. And in case of India, Shastri bemoans the lack of informed and in-depth analysis, as he very rightly pointed out just now, about India's neighborhood, uh, all in all, and particularly, of course, about India's relationship in China with China. And he underscores the need for Indian media to move beyond the shadow of India-China border dispute and not define the whole set of relations or set ideologies vis-a-vis each other. And the author also accurately points out that China fared significantly better than many Western nations in terms of global financial crisis of 2008. And uh, he also points out towards the dark side of the economic transformation that China has had at the turn of this century. And there's another very interesting quote by him, and I quote: appalling disparities in income, rising unemployment, rural population displacement, widespread corruption, criminality, massive environmental degradation, pockets of extreme poverty, social sickness, discontent of the have-nots, and restive minorities in the Tibet and Xinjiang region. Basically summarize the problems or the basket of problems that China has in front of it, despite a very, very phenomenal success that it enjoyed in terms of its economic transformation. And I think this is acknowledged by the author that the accomplishment in the field of intellectual, physical, economic, infrastructural development that China has had, uh, a more comprehensive, aspect of, mapping these transformations would be to concentrate on what got left behind and to link it with how it got reflected in the post pandemic recovery would be a very, very interesting thing to maybe explore in the next you know book, if he has one in mind, and he must have that in mind. And finally, with the summarizing refrain of not letting the US push or influence India's China policy, and that China must create conditions for the two countries to pursue reconciliation in the mutual interest of each other in a peaceful environment. I think Shastri presents a very, very important conflict resolution oriented proposition. Indeed, with this book, he has created a countercurrent, especially when the prevalent atmosphere, climate around India China discourse is basically regarding the zero sum game that the two countries seem to have with each other. So I join the fraternity in congratulating Shastri for a very, very interesting book, especially because it's the antithetical conflict resolution oriented proposition that he's giving from the Indian side, which is not really the common flavor. So thank you so much for that, and it was indeed an honor and pleasure to be the discussant for this book here and as well as elsewhere. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Over to
Ritusha.
Ritu.
Thank you, Ritusha, for a very interesting and enlightening analysis of the book. Uh, Mr. Ramachandran, if you would like to respond to what Ritusha has said, please go ahead.
No, if I, I would, I don't see how I can respond because uh, it's been so, I won't say flattering. She's not come across as flattering, but I think her appraisal of the book and she's captured so clearly what I'm trying to say and the narrative, and has probably expressed it better than I succeeded in doing while introducing the book. And I think it makes for a strong recommendation for the book to the community of China studies scholars, in the sense that whether they agree with it or not, that it merits attention and it should be read for what it says, because it is a departure from the kind of narratives that we are accustomed to. And I recognize that, as she said, that what I've written about the media in China is not adequate. It is very fascinating, but I could have written a lot more. But then this book is not about the media as such. I was locating it more in the processes of the many of the world of India and China and spaces that they are negotiating. And in that context, how the media functions and responds and kind of reports and organizes writings and perceptions. So I think there is a deficit. If one were to write about the media, it would have to be a whole book by itself, you know. But I'm glad that this gives a kind of a bird's eye view, or would you say a little more than that, Ritusha? Thank you.
Okay, so well, before I open this to the floor, I have an observation to make, and well, it's something that I realized now, just now, that on the one hand we say that India is peripheral to the Chinese worldview, but on the other hand we see that the number of India scholars in China are many times more than that of China scholars in India. So that's something that I would say is very interesting, and maybe someone can find that out why that is the case. Okay, so the floor is now open, and as Shikhar said, that you can raise your hands, or raise hand option, or you can write down your questions here. So I'm sure Ravi will have something to say. Ravi, can
Excuse
you
me,
hear
ma'am.
me?
There's a participant named Hiram
My
Ashraf who has raised his hand.
Okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, let the
Hello,
person ask the question, yeah.
hello, can you hear
Ravi,
me?
the audio is not yet.
Yeah,
Mm,
hello, can you hear me? I was trying
yeah.
to get the video to start also, but I can't. I think the host has stopped me from doing the video even. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate the ICS for organizing this talk, because it was such a pleasure to listen to Mr. Ramachandran and his book regarding the China and India relations. It was very refreshing. And I commend ICS for introducing such a variety of opinions on China-India relations. It was very, very interesting. So my question, to be honest, it's more of a reflection of what I've heard, because I haven't read the book as yet, but I would really like to now, because I hope includes some of the experiences of Mr. Ramachandran from his time in China. Is that, when you said you kind of take a holistic view of your time period in India, I'm sorry, in China, and then you're trying to look at the relation with a critical lens, because that's what you're doing. It's a critical lens, because you're not following the traditional trajectory of the relations that is put out there in media or whatever. Do you think it's a reflection of the time period? Because the time period you've chosen is 2008-22, roughly. So do you think what we see now in the kind of, as you pointed out, negative media reporting, it reflects the situation post Galowan and, further de, further deterioration on the border situation? Or do you think that no, it's regardless of this, that this is happening? And also, I'd like to hear your view on social media, because you speak of media, but what about the role social media has now been playing in these relations? Thank you.
Would you like to respond now, Mr. Ramchandran?
Yeah, I'll answer both these questions. And first thing is taking a holistic view of looking at the relations with a critical lens. I think uh, maybe when you say holistic, I could have looked at a wider spectrum of the relations, and also many areas of China which have got left out of here and which people in India are interested in. And for example, the one area which has been altogether left out is that of technology, not just science and technology in a general sense, but a lot of technology is imported from China into India. And the usefulness of this, what drives India to China to get technology, its inexpensiveness. And on the other hand, India is said to be competing with China to get in terms of technology and taking its own technology to other countries. So I have not looked at this area. I have not looked at sports in China, for instance. In fact, a lot of the transformation that I witnessed in China in 2008 was driven by the Olympics of 2008. Had it not been for the Olympics of 2008, when I landed there might not have been so many people who speak English, for instance. Almost every taxi driver was trained, and the variety of aids one requires to walk, to shop, to talk, to buy things, to find one's way, all of it in English in various forms. And for instance, it made life so easy. Like there was not a single place where I went to where even to order food I had a problem. The lady or the man at the counter would just come with their mobile and they say, you say in this, in whatever language you want. I say what I want, and then they get it translated and they're able to deliver it and tell me back in English the words. So there are many areas there have been spectacular progress, which one did not associate with China and which I could see happening. When I first went in 2008, it was about 8 months before the Olympics. And when I went some 15 months later to work, I could see how all these efforts had fructified. And in fact, even the rise of the English media there, number of Chinese people speaking English, writing in English, then kind of creating media and newspapers and magazines were all directly, in a way, an offshoot of the many efforts that went into the Olympics. Although the Olympics was the focus, it had a lot of other consequences, and largely, I would say, positive. So then coming to Galwan and post Galwan, actually, I think both India and China, or like many parts of the world, especially developing countries, they are stuck in a certain phase of history. That this whole obsession with boundaries. I mean, I might sound like an alien saying it here, but you have the example of countries which have not got stuck and remained riveted in a kind of difficult situation over the boundary. I wholly agree with the position that was there during uh, Dr. Manmohan Singh's time, and which was held by many people, that if they are stuck on the boundary issue, well, let's open up all other channels and get on with the business of relationship and building it on the many channels on which it can work. Instead, the conflict has been vitiated, even with a lot of words, and invested with so much other meaning and context and so on, which makes it even more complicated to resolve. And it would take a lot to kind of untie it and kind of sort it out. Whereas I remember, for instance, the most recent thing that comes to my mind, which I had also written about once in Chinese media, is for CGTN, was when Putin and Abe met, the Japanese prime minister and the Russian president. Both of them know that the northern territories issue cannot be resolved, because neither country can afford to give up territory. There is a lot of nationalism and nationalist sentiments involved, and neither country can afford to be seen as a loser. And today's situation, although the world wanted to see Japan defeated in the war, today, the very countries which bombed Japan and wanted to see it defeated would not like to see Japan capitulate to Russia and such powers. Because there's also a very clear expectation that if a developing country or even a developed country capitulates, it should capitulate to only a certain section of the powers, not to all of them. So in this situation, I found fascinating was that Putin and Abe, they spoke about joint development of the border. I don't know if it is feasible or not for large countries, joint development of the border. Also, Russia and Japan, one would say, even the size is asymmetric, but the economies are very powerful. So when they spoke of joint development, of course, since then nothing has happened. But the fact is, it has stilled the waters of great expectations as well as any kind of impulses of hostility that might have begun gathering. Why can't India and China also think of joint development? You have the example of Finland and Sweden, the island of Jutland, and I've spent a lot of time in Copenhagen and Sweden. And now, when they talk of the Malmo Copenhagen region, it is like talking of Colombo Chennai region, or Colombo Cochin. I mean, would the developing countries, India particularly, provide the thought leadership to these kind of things? Secondly, uh, I have also been involved in some of these conferences on the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Forum, BCIM as it is called. And I was there for one of the BCIM conferences in the Central University in Sikkim, when Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, as foreign minister, made a statement, and it struck me as very odd because I was there in a border area. He said, we need peace on the borders and progress and development at the center. So it is as if, peace is instrumental for internal development. It is not necessarily a condition for coexistence of the people there with their neighbors. And from what I have read, I'm sure there are people like uh, Professor Patricia Oberoi here and many others who would know this thing better. But in my understanding, I think the people who are on the borders of Bangladesh, Myanmar, India, and China, who are living contiguously, are probably closer to each other than the people and the mind which are working on a resolution of boundary issues with this country. They're closer than the people who are than the people in Dhaka and Delhi, or Delhi and Kathmandu, or Delhi and Beijing. So is it possible that we look at them as stakeholders and people who locate themselves within the expectations of those people are allowed greater primacy, at least to propose what solutions might be considered before debating whether they are feasible? And I think joint development is a good thing. After all, if a border is developed, it will have a lot of uses. If it remains undeveloped, then we run every risk of what we saw in Galwan. So the last question is on social media. I think social media has a great role in China. And I want to quickly recall the effort launched by Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State in 2010, 9 and 10, when they spoke of the internet as the fifth freedom and so on. And there was a huge campaign against China and its restriction. And a lot of IT giants, companies like Google and all joined this campaign. Till then, of course, they were very comfortable with China, and the maps they showed were not accurate as far as India was concerned, but they were all interested in doing business with China. But as China grew and they developed Baidu as a challenge to Google, and people could get on with Baidu or Weibo, and they didn't need Facebook and Twitter and Google and so on. I think that is what, and the very fear that Chinese technology would steal a march over American technology, which largely dominates the world, and they would lose the business in a country of more than 1 billion people, is what started the campaign. And then they all were conditioned to believe that Chinese social media is just a propaganda arm. But it might be a propaganda arm as much as the social media is for any country, for any individual or party, whether it is in the United States or India. And we saw how Twitter functions with regard to Trump and with regard to Biden and with regard to India, how Facebook, what kind of partisan positions it has taken. We have seen all these things. So it is not as if the democracies are an exception to this manipulation of social media. But what surprised me was I was in Jinan when Bo Xilai was convicted. I happened to be there on a program, and I was really astonished. There were 1 million microblogs that exploded on China's sites, and it was really astonishing to see that the firewalls of censorship would not suppress or squash these things before they erupted. So Bo Xilai was a figure who inspired that kind of response to his conviction and to his arrest and what was perceived as his persecution, even if it was for corruption. So what the impression that left with me is that there are very there are sections who are still communicating. There is a different sociology of communication which is driving the content of social media. And this can erupt in spite of the heavy hand of the Chinese state. So social media is very advanced in China, and it is a pity that they are not able to see as much of it and understand as much of it as we should in our own interest because of our limitations with the language. And I wish somebody would do, I mean, this is subject for a huge exploration in many tomes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramachandran, for a very detailed and elaborate response to the question. Now, before I request Shikhar to, you know, to find out who the next person is for questions, I'd like to tell Mr. Ramachandran that there is a bit of good news for you. One of the participants wants to know where the book is available, and probably he wishes to buy it. So please give this information.
Okay. No, normally the publisher is very kind of supportive and helpful. And wherever there is a seminar or a discussion, he is most willing to bring copies of the book. But the book is available in India on Amazon and Flipkart. And worldwide also, it is available on Amazon.com. And if anybody wants a copy of the book, they can also directly contact the publisher. It is the Institute of Objective Studies through the institution or Genuine Publications. Or I have given my email ID in the flap of the book. It's beyondbinaries@outlook.com. They mail me, I will forward it to the publisher and he will arrange for it. It is also available in a few shops like Binaries and some other shops. The book is away in Khan Market.
Okay, thank you. I hope that information is useful for Anupam Khanna. Uh, now, yes, Shikhar, any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
The participant Ranjit Rai has raised hand.
Okay.
And also, I can see raised hand for Ravi Bhutalingam, sir.
Ravi has been raising his hand for quite some time.
Okay, then let Ravi,
Yeah.
speak first, and then the next person. Yes, Ravi.
Congratulations, Shastri, on this book. I think it is an eye opener, as was said. Uh, I am eagerly awaiting. It's been sent to me. I think I'm getting it in a day or two. So I'm looking forward to reading it. One thing struck me, which I'm sure you will have an answer for. It comes from your title, Beyond Binaries. Now, as you rightly said, in India, there is a particularly binary view of China, focusing more on the negative than positives. Now, several other countries which have a rather complicated relationships with China, notably the US, parts of the EU, and others, Japan, for example, have nevertheless, despite those complications, been able to engage much more greatly with China. Whether it is tourism, whether it is business, whether it is academics, those countries have had equally rough relationships. Japan has fought several wars. Vietnam has fought. There are tense times in the South China Sea. So what is it that makes it so difficult for us to expand our horizon? Let us say we still have this complicated situation on the board, unresolved. Still, is it not possible to fill some of the other gaps with a little more creativity and originality, like these other countries have? That was my thought, just from your title.
Yes, would you like to answer this? Respond to
Yeah.
this, Mr. Ramachandran?
Yeah. Good one. Yes. Thank you, Ravi, for that question. It reminds me that when I was bringing out the China-India dialogue, this is an issue we had discussed, and Ravi had written one of the most insightful articles on tourism and how it can be a channel of engagement and developing relations with these two countries. Now, in my conclusion, I have responded to this question of the point that you made that India has a binary view of China and negative relations. However, even the USA and Japan, despite having negative relations with China, they have doing they're wholly engaged with China and they are doing extraordinarily well in their relations with China. And this point is not being brought out at all by the Indian media. And after all, we have so few China scholars. You cannot say, oh, why are China scholars not doing this? I think every China scholar, China studies scholar in India is already doing so much more than it is humanly possible to, because it's such a vast subject. But I have pointed this out in more than one piece. Some of these pieces are not in this book. For instance, I remember the Shangri-La dialogue. Every year, you will find there will be an admiral of the US or a Pentagon official who will go there, and there will be several pot shots taken at China. And we will report all these things and how the Indian representative also made these noises. But what never gets reported is probably a week after that, there is the US Secretary of State and Treasury who is there in Beijing for 3 days for a strategic and security dialogue. I do not recall a single occasion in the last 16 years when the Indian media has kind of taken up this and said, what is it that China and the US do for 3 days in their security and economic dialogue? How do they sustain this dialogue year after year? What are the depths to which it goes? How do they link? So it is like a pro forma statement where each person says, like, okay, this is the US position on South China Sea, and China says, no, no, we are opposed to US militarization. Okay, after that, they sit down to business and they get on with it. Similarly, with Japan, I realized that there are so many Japanese restaurants in Beijing. There is a Japanese supermarket which is as full as the Walmart of the United States or Carrefour's of the French, all of them. One finds that it is a lot of rhetoric, but there is far more than the noise, there are factors that bind them. Japan and China have a Tokyo Forum and a Beijing Forum. Then there is another forum, it's called the Bao Forum, which is Japan, Korea, and China. So there are a lot of commonalities that the US, Japan, and China and Korea are pursuing with these countries, which are not being highlighted adequately, are not even being taken note of in our perceptions of China and its international relations. So I think I agree with Ravi very much on that. It is possible for Indians to be creative, but I feel there are very powerful Western interests, not only in India, but in China too, which do not want any kind of a breakthrough, where the floodgates of the relationship would be open. They don't even want it to be like what it is between Punjab and Lahore when there is a cricket match. And my understanding from what I have heard is that China is making a lot of effort and had, at least when I was there, to win over Indians. For instance, one of the things I've asked people there, young people who come from the US, Harvard and all, and studying there, I asked them, but how do you study in China? They said, why not? I said, what about food? They said, no, we eat everything, so we don't have a problem. But now in this place in Hangzhou, that university, that province, they have a separate kitchen, Indian kitchen for the students. And many of the Indian students are being given en-suite, rooms, which they are not even sharing, these research scholars. All these things have been specially done for India. And China is doing this for several countries. And I feel India, especially Indian students, can take advantage of this because China, at least it was, I don't know how post-COVID, was between say 2010 and 20 what the US and Soviet Union were for developing countries, where they sought to woo them, take them, throw them, pamper them, and were competing with each other to get more people from developing countries. And China is opening up, and there are people from almost every country in China who are heavily subsidized in their education and travel and food and stay and so on when it is education, even if it is mid-career education and so on. And the other interesting is this time I found that the trade is increasing. China has announced 180,000 visas this year for Indians. So when I checked this, the person who traveled to China for technology and other business, he said, but you see, India has not responded. So I said, how can India respond? They can't gather people. They said, no, there is not a single flight from India to Beijing. So these visas, he says, if it is 1.8, it means, let's say, 500,000 visits. And all this money of this 500 visits would go to foreign airlines. None of this would come to it. And then he says at the same time, India has aircraft leased from Chinese companies. So there is so much of these kind of contradictory happenings that they are creative. If they are creative, but not adequately to create new driving factors to kind of raise the level of the relationship and the depth of the relationship. And I think this point which Ravi has been making needs to be really discussed, and whether it should, I unless it becomes state policy, that we need to intensify this relationship and that we will find a way to do it. It's not going to happen.
Okay, so Shikhar, back to you.
Yes, ma'am. Ranjit Rai has raised hand, and we also have a question in the chat box as well. So we'll start with Ranjit Rai.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Ma'am, I think he's having trouble starting his switching on his audio. We can then move on to the question in the chat box. So in the chat box, we have a question from Vijay Naik. His question is to you, sir. Do you foresee India and China resolving boundary disputes, say in the next couple of decades? We have had more than 30 rounds of special representative talks without knowing where we are now.
No, I think it's very difficult for the boundary issue to be even broached, given the present political, as long as the present political leadership is there in both these countries. It is not anything personal in terms of my perception of the leadership, but both the Indian position as well as the Chinese position is so identified with the personalities and the politics of the present day leadership that they will have to really kind of make a big breakthrough for it to happen, for anything to happen on the boundary issue. And they are not, as far as India is concerned, it is not even willing to discuss the boundary as an issue till other things, still there is some normalization. But whether it's like a chicken and egg question, you deal with the boundary question, it may lead to normalization. Or are you going to first have normalization and then discuss the boundary issue? This is a kind of a cycle which has to be broken. How it is to be done, who will do it, where the process will begin. I mean, these are all questions we can discuss, we can debate endlessly, but ultimately it is the state and its agents and representatives who have to take a call. But there is one positive development. That is, after 15 months, there was no Chinese ambassador in India. We have had an ambassador who has come here, which clearly suggests that a lot of conversation is going on behind the curtains where we can't see them, but things are happening and they are moving. And there are people and channels on both sides committed to a conversation and accepting the limitations of each side. The second thing, which is very disturbing, where I think resolution of the boundary issue will be very difficult, is the kind of nationalistic fervor that is brought to every issue, where it kind of cold, hard-headed rationalism seems to be kind of eluding those who have to deal with these questions. Unless that happens, I mean, the people can say what they want about the Chinese, but you cannot troll whole countries and races and people as is happening in social media. And foreign policy cannot be left to trolls in the social media, nor can it even pay the least regard to that sentiment. But unfortunately, often one finds that colors perceptions even at higher levels. So I don't see early resolution of the boundary issue. And of course, there are powerful vested interests. Would by vested interests, obviously a lot of arms manufacturers, there are powerful financial and economic and security interests which are so well entrenched and have much to profit from sustaining a situation that is just short of a conflict, because this would mean a kind of, for instance, everybody says it openly that if India and China were to come together, then it would be kind of not viewed favorably by the US. And this is nothing new. More than 2 decades ago, Kishore Mehbubani has written in his book that the main kind of geopolitical dance would be between India, China, and the US, which two can be can come together against the third, and which one will be able to keep the other two apart. And I think this is still to play out, which are the two that can tango and take things forward.
All right. Any other questions?
Ma'am, Ranjit Bhai still has his hand raised, but if he can have his audio switched on, so if he could ask the question, or we can move on.
His audio is on. I think he can raise the question now.
No, I think we can.
Can you please repeat it? I didn't follow. Okay. Ranjit Rise.
Ma'am, I think we can move on.
Sorry?
Okay.
Ma'am, I think we can move on. He's having trouble starting his audio.
Okay, that's okay. Now, anybody else?
Commodore Ranjit Rai.
Some issue with his audio.
You can see his hand?
I cannot.
Okay.
Anybody else, Shikhar?
No, ma'am, there's no one else. The questions are done.
Okay, so we come to the end of this book discussion. I'd like to thank Mr. Ramachandran, Ritusha, and all the ICS related people who joined us for this book discussion. It was a very exciting experience for me, and I'm sure most of you are now looking forward to reading the book. So happy reading, and thanks once again.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all. With this, we conclude the discussion and express our gratitude to Mr. Shastri Ramachandran, Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari, and Professor Srimati Chakrabarti for generously sharing their time with us. We also thank the participants for attending this session. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICSS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar. The title of the seminar is EU-China Relations, Navigating Perilous Paths. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you.